Several weeks into our investigation, we located Steve's first wife, Gabrielle. It was more difficult than we expected, as she was hiding out in a rural suburb of St. Louis. Over the course of a 2-hour-long interview, we learned more about Steve and his propensity for violence. Gabrielle met Steve in high school. She quickly became pregnant and had a daughter named Jillian. The couple married, and it didn't take long before the relationship descended into violence. Toward the end, Steve repeatedly abused Gabrielle until she and her daughter, they were forced to leave the state. Gabrielle continued to ask Steve for child support, and that was really their only interaction. A few years later, Steve tracked them both down in Missouri. He showed up at their home, drunk, and threatened to kill them both if they contacted him in the future. Gabrielle stopped asking for support.
I don't know if he actually would have killed us, but I know I didn't want to test him. Listen, if I knew anything for sure, it was that Steve absolutely did not want any more children. The last thing he ever said to us was that he wished Jillian had never been born.
At this point, we knew when Tammy disappeared and where she was last seen. But we still lacked the information as to why she disappeared when she did. There must have been a reason why she disappeared from our city in May of 2000 rather than March or April or June. I knew the fuse leading up to her disappearance would provide us with answers and point to the reason why she disappeared in the first place. On the day Tammy vanished, it was as if a bomb exploded, and our investigation revealed some of the events that ignited the fuse. The auto shop, where Steve was employed, it opened its doors in our city in January of 2000. 3 months later, in April, this new job prompted Steve and Tammy to move here so Steve could be closer to his job. If the explosive disappearance of Tammy was going to occur in our city, it could only happen after they moved to our city. It would have to occur in a red zone resulting from their relocation. Steve borrowed a barrel that Ted got from his employer in June of 1999. Steve didn't ask for the barrel until May of 2000. If he needed that barrel to dispose of Tammy's body, the red zone in which this crime could take place would be a month smaller. Steve also needed the right chemicals to use in the barrel, however, and he purchased these after getting the barrel from Ted. That means our red zone of opportunity is even smaller than before. If this crime was going to happen in our city in the manner that it did, it would have to happen after May of 2000. We also know that Steve didn't want any more kids, and Tammy was pregnant. If Steve wanted to get rid of Tammy before she had the baby and before she was showing and could even tell his family about the baby, he would have to act fast. Tammy was planning a trip to tell Steve's family about her pregnancy later in the month of May of 2000. That means our red zone is much smaller than before, beginning after Steve had everything he needed to dispose of Tammy's body and ending prior to Tammy's disclosure of the pregnancy. The window for this crime to occur, the way it did, was small. And it just so happened to coincide with Steve's actions related to the barrel and the chemicals and his fear of the pregnancy being revealed. Our red zone points to Steve as the likely cause of Tammy's disappearance. There are now 3 strands of the fuse: cultural, spiritual, and prophetic, burning toward the start of the common era. Something important was about to change history, and it was going to happen in a red zone of its own. You can begin to see it by examining the spiritual strand of the fuse. Let's chart the time spans in which the ancient deities and myths were worshipped. We'll draw a timeline and and start with the worship of Osiris from 3300 BCE to 250 CE. Now we'll systematically overlap the periods in which the other major deities were worshipped. Now that all the time spans have been superimposed, you may notice something familiar: a red zone. If the true God of the universe wanted to interact with humanity and meet the expectations of the greatest number of worshipers possible, wouldn't he want to arrive at a time when all these expectations and myths overlapped? If that were the case, the real God of the universe would likely appear in the red zone from 350 BCE to 250 CE, the period in history when the largest number of ancient mythologies were still active. Now let's chart the cultural strand of the fuse and superimpose it on the spiritual strand we just illustrated. The technological and cultural developments of the Roman Empire were also burning toward the Common Era. For example, Rome had conquered most of the known world by 146 BCE. They adopted the Etruscan alphabet, the Greek language, and provided a common way to communicate throughout the empire. In addition to this, they mastered road construction and established the finest ancient postal service. The empire provided stability to the region until it fell in 410 CE, and even secured a 200-year peace known as the Pax Romana. If God exists and wanted to enter his creation at a time when spiritually minded humans were imagining the nature of God and had access to these increased cultural opportunities to travel and transmit the truth of God's existence, the new red zone we now see on the timeline from 29 BCE to 180 CE would be the perfect time. Let's now add the final strand of our historic fuse. The ancient Jews were already anticipating God's intercession in human history and had been predicting it for centuries. The most specific prophecy from a reliable prophet named Daniel predicted the Messiah would come after an edict to rebuild Jerusalem. One was issued in 444 BCE, and before the destruction of the temple, which we know occurred in 70 CE. Daniel's prophecy provides us with another overlap in our timeline, and it creates a new red zone. If the Jews were worshiping the one true God, and this God desired to leverage the spiritual and cultural red zone while arriving within the range of Daniel's prediction, he would appear in history between 29 BCE and 70 CE. The explosive moment marking the start of the Common Era sits perfectly within this range from 29 BCE to 70 CE. History transitioned from BCE to CE in this tight window of opportunity. If you're new to studying ancient history, aren't you at least a little curious about the explosion that inaugurated the Common Era? Don't you want to know specifically what or who it was that changed human history forever? Was it a political event? An edict of government? An act of war? What or who on earth was powerful enough to turn history on its ear and reset our calendars forever? Was it possible the explosive appearance of a single person of interest was responsible for disrupting our human calendar? One thing seems certain. The three-stranded fuse that burned toward the Common Era seemed to make Jesus' arrival inevitable. He met our human expectations, matched the Jewish predictions, and arrived at precisely the right time in the history of the Roman Empire to be shared with the entire known world. A New Testament writer, the Apostle Paul, wrote, "But when the fullness of time had come, God sent forth his Son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law, so that we might receive adoption as sons." What did Paul mean when he described Jesus' arrival as coming in the fullness of time? Did God send Jesus at just the right moment in history? The few certainly seem to agree. But every explosion, whether a criminal act or an important historical event, has both a fuse and some fallout, and I still had more to investigate. If Jesus truly mattered, the fallout of history would be cluttered with evidence. The case for Jesus was far from complete.